I'm going to walk you through a formula for figuring out how much yeast you need to store. It's going to be a little bit confusing, so if you have trouble with it, you can just follow the general recommendations, but I will walk you through it in case you want to use it for your recipes. How much yeast do you think you need for the amount of flour and grain you have stored? I start with what I'm going to use the recipe for. And my recipe for French bread calls for 2 tablespoons of yeast with a total of 6 cups of flour in the recipe. Makes 2 loaves, or it makes 12 individual loaves, roughly 12, 10, 12. So if I use 2 tablespoons of yeast for 6 cups of flour, that's 1 tablespoon of yeast for 3 cups of flour. That's a little more yeast than is in a lot of other bread recipes, but since this is the one I use, that's the numbers I'm going to derive my numbers from that. There's 16 tablespoons of flour or water or whatever in a cup. And so my 3 cups of flour for 1 tablespoon of yeast would be a 1 to 48 ratio. 16 and 16 is 48. So it would be 1 tablespoon of yeast for 48 tablespoons of flour. Now I can't take into consideration the difference of the density that does come into play, so it's not going to be completely accurate, the difference between the density of the yeast and the density of the flour. So I'm probably losing you right about here. But there is a difference in the density. The yeast is a little more dense, it's a little heavier per tablespoon. But we're just going to talk roundhouse figures. So we're going to round that up to 1 tablespoon of flour for every 50 tablespoons of yeast. That would be the same equivalent 1 to 50 ratio of 1 pound of yeast for 50 pounds of flour, not taking into consideration the density differences. So for bread in my food storage, I would use a 1 to 50 ratio for every 50 pounds of wheat or every 50 pounds of flour in my storage. I would have a 1 pound package of yeast, and that would cover me for bread making. I would suggest that you at least plan for your bread making of having a 1 to 50 ratio to make sure you got like overkill. I'm getting a little tired. It's late in the afternoon. I'm sorry. Trying to focus and concentrate here. You can look at some of the other recipes that you might plan to use on a repeated basis, such as cinnamon rolls, sticky buns, donuts, and look at what the yeast to flour ratio is. Take into consideration that there's 16 tablespoons for a cup, so you can get the math down on paper and calculate it out if you'd like to have a more accurate calculation. And that's the end of the topic. 1 to 50 works. 1 to 50 ratio works for me. So figure out what works for you. If you don't want to go through the math, about a 1 to 50 ratio is going to be about safe. 1 pound of yeast for about 50 pounds of flour for bread making or donut making or roll making or cinnamon rolls or sticky buns or what have you. That's the end. Have a great day, afternoon, weekend. I gotta quit saying that. Thanks. Bye.